All right, thank you everyone. Welcome to this webinar and live cast of Understanding the Female Libido and things that couples need to know to have radically fulfilling sex. My name is Irene Fehr. I'm an intimacy and sex coach, and I'm so thrilled to have everyone joining from all over the world on this call. I have people registered from Australia, Spain, Canada, all over the US, and I'm so excited to share this information with you. And I want to acknowledge your courage to be here on this call as well. This is a sensitive topic, both because sex has been and still is very much taboo, and because oftentimes when we're talking about sex, the pain and the hardships around it, the struggles run deep. And so thank you for your courage to be here. And thank you for choosing me to spend this hour and a half together. Now, this topic is important for many women and men. This topic really changes relationships. And I work with women and couples, many of whom come to me feeling like they're broken, or they feel like they know that there's more, but they don't know how to get there. So your reasons might be similar to those for being here. You might want more for yourself, more pleasure, enjoyment, joy, and you want the different tools and paths to get there. You might have joined this call because this area feels really hard and painful for your relationship and for you, and you want to understand what's going on with your body and what's going on with your partners. You may feel shame around your sexuality and want to break through that. You may have a sense of what you want but don't know how to get there and how to get more of it. You may feel discouraged about your lack of desire and have contemplated whether you are asexual. You may have gone to doctors such as gynecologists and other specialists, and you found that they didn't have the answers for you or even had insensitive ones, and you don't know where else to turn. You may feel less than courageous to address this with your partner and need some help, or you might be right there sitting with your partner watching this together. Or you are a partner of a woman struggling with these questions and you want to understand more of how to support her. You're not alone, and you're so welcome here. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, a lot of information, lots of new insights and thought-provoking perspectives. And the good news for women is that when you understand the mechanics of your sexual libido, you can begin to take control of your sexuality and access its potential. And for men, understanding female sexuality enables you to relate and see more of what your partner is going through, and also to co-create a deeper experience of enjoyment in your sex life. And that, of course, is a benefit for the couple as well. And that's why I'm here. I want to share with you this information so you can make choices that serve your body and also serve your relationship in creating deeper understanding, connection, intimacy, sexual pleasure, turn on, ecstasy, you name it. And we'll be talking about all of that. Now, this information is not going to heal all sexual wounds, but it will open the door to a deeper understanding and context for some of the issues that many women and couples, as a result, struggle with. This is a beginning of a conversation. And I invite you to continue the conversation with each other and with myself after this webinar. And I'll be providing you some options on how to do that at the end of the hour. And what I want the most is to share with you what's really possible when a woman is turned on, what's possible for her and what's possible for her partner, and what's possible for the relationship. And to the women on this webinar, I want to say to you, you are not broken and you are capable of joyful, fulfilling, nourishing sex. And my hope is that this information will help you get there. Now, before we continue, I want to touch upon a couple of logistical items. So this webinar is one way. So all participant cameras are turned off and you do not have to worry about privacy. I will speak for about an hour and then turn it over for Q&A for about 30 minutes. If you want to ask a question, which I really encourage that you do, you please use the Q&A functionality at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. And feel free to mark your questions anonymous if you do not want to have your name showing, which would only show for me. I'll be answering questions that were submitted ahead of time, and then also the ones that will come up in the queue here on the live cast. And be sure to stay till the end of the hour when I'm going to be making a special offer that will require a quick response on your part. And be sure to check your email afterwards too. After the webcast is over, you will receive a recording that may be either tonight or tomorrow morning, depending on how technology will work. And lastly, I have a request for you. This is a topic that's sensitive on so many levels. And I want you to be mindful of how you are feeling by tuning into your body and checking in with yourself. How am I doing? What's here? What do I need? Taking care of yourself is going to be really important here. And you will be practicing one of the most important skills of self-care here that actually serves you in your sexuality as well. And we'll get to that later as I explain that. So again, I ask you to take care of yourself, to check in about what you need as we are talking about a sensitive topic. And now I briefly want to tell you a little bit about myself and why am I leading this webcast and why am I speaking with you today about this topic. So I am an intimacy and sexuality coach today, but 10 years ago, I was a married woman who met the man of her dreams and had a wonderful beginning to my relationship. Sex was hot, it was passionate, we were having a lot of it several times a day. And I did not see myself as someone who was in any way having problems sexually. I was new to sex. I was a little bit of a late bloomer. But the beginning was wonderful. Fairy tale, perfect start of a relationship. And we really were into each other. And so our relationship progressed and we moved in together. We were in graduate school together. And then we very quickly moved off campus into our own place and started to build our life together. And something else parallel to that was happening. In our sex life, I started to get dry. And the first thing I did was I went to a gynecologist at the graduate school clinic and mentioned the problem, and I was told to use lube. And this is a common advice for so many women. If you get dry, use lube. So I continued using lube and continued having penetration sex. And very quickly after that, I started noticing that I was very tight and there was pain upon entry. And very quickly after that, I started to develop pain inside. So my partner's penis would bump up against my cervix, and that would be very painful, excruciatingly painful. I went back to the gynecologist. I went back to several doctors, including going to a lung specialist and getting a CAT scan to see if maybe there was a lump this big that was pushing on my cervix and creating this pain. And pretty much everyone said that nothing was wrong with me. And most of the doctors basically shrugged their shoulders and said, well, pain during sex is common and that's how it is. The gynecologist said that getting dry and also losing interest in sex is also natural in a long-term relationship. Because what was also happening is after the pain became excruciating, I lost any desire for sex. And there was also something else happening, which was I was never able to orgasm, not by myself, not with my partner. And so I also went to the gynecologist asking, well, what's wrong with me? What's going on? And I got the same shrugging of the shoulders and telling me, well, some women just don't orgasm, and maybe you're one of them. And all of this led me to think, what's wrong with me? Why am I broken? Why is my body broken? What's going on? And I started believing the feedback from the doctors that maybe I just don't like sex and maybe I am asexual. Maybe sex is just not for me. Maybe I am one of those women, the way doctors told me, that is just not meant for sex. And I started believing that, and that started to lead to a lot of shutdown, a lot of shame about myself, about my body, and then eventual disconnect from my body altogether because I didn't want to face this brokenness that I had, and eventual depression. And in that depression, I felt a lack of confidence, a lack of radiance and inner fire. There was this grayness to my life, a feeling of stuckness and brokenness as a woman. My fundamental core identity as a woman, I felt like it was shattered with this. And this progressed. So my husband became my ex-husband as we divorced because there was also a lack of connection for us around this topic. We weren't having sex, but we also weren't talking about what was happening for us. And that created a disconnect that led to divorce. And in the 4 years following that, I retreated from sexual activity and from men and from trying to find a relationship because I was really terrified of basically meeting a man and then telling him, I just don't like sex. That's just who I am. And my depression got worse and my aliveness got diminished. But I knew something was really not right here. I was living my life. I was not living my life. I was surviving it. I was barely making it through the day, and I knew that there was something really wrong about this. And so I sought help, and I went out and got a sex coach to fix the problem. That's how I saw it, to fix myself. And the biggest breakthrough came for me when I learned the information that I'm about to share with you, and not just intellectually learned, but actually learned it in my body through physical practices, some of which I'm going to teach you or talk to you about today. And somehow all those moments that I had an inkling that there is something more available from sex. There is something more available from intimacy, from sexual connection with another person. I started to realize them. The feelings of ecstasy, those feelings of having that my body get turned on and feel alive and have that kind of confidence and freedom and openness that I, again, had this inkling was possible. I started to have that in my life. And so I started to want to share this with the world because I know that as a woman who once assumed that I was asexual and who couldn't reach orgasm and was able to do that and change my life, I know you can too. And now as a certified coach trained in sexuality, relationship dynamics, I'm a student of John Gottman, David Schnarch, and also somatic experiencing and many other different modalities that I teach my clients practices and paths to help them learn this on their own in their bodies in a safe space and container to do that. So that's how that's why I'm here. And that's what's really important to me is to share this information and to transfer this knowledge to you so that you can also have this in your life. Now on to the topic. So first I want to start with the definition of libido. So libido at a simple level means your sex drive. It refers to your appetite for sex or lack thereof when we think of lack of libido. And when we think of libido, we think actually of a universal libido, like one way to have a sex drive for sex. But this is actually not the case. Most of the theories, if not all, theories, research, understandings of libido come from men, male therapists such as Freud, research on men, so both psychological and medical research until recently was performed on men. And also the messages that we get from media, which is also created by men. And so the science of women's sexuality and holistic well-being is relatively new. And when I say holistic well-being, I mean well-being that actually involves our sexuality and what it means to have wellness in our sexuality. That is very, very new. And so all this time, through media, through culture, through psychology, through the medical research, we've been learning one way to do sex. And that hasn't been really working well for women. And so what I want to do with this webinar is to pose a couple of questions. So what if there is a different way that women function sexually? And what if that way can actually bring richness and fulfillment that we're all seeking, women and men and couples? And I'm going to put out this bold claim. What if by not understanding the female sexuality, we're actually missing the biggest cause of women losing their libido in relationships and perpetuating the problem of sexless marriages, or ones where sex, it happens without pleasure or connection? And according to statistics, that's 1 in 3 relationships. So we think of that libido, that sex drive, one way. And that one way usually looks like this. You have a thought of something sexy. It could be your partner, it could be some sexy image. And you decide, I would like to have some sex tonight. You see a billboard of a beautiful person, man or woman, and you think, wow, I really want to have sex with them. You basically think a sexy thought, and the desire for sex pops up instantaneously. Now, this is what's called spontaneous desire. And writer Emily Nagoski, in her book, Come As You Are, details this aspect of desire. This is how approximately 75% of men and 15% of women function. And they have this spontaneous desire. But what about the other 85% of women and 25% of men? What happens to them? Well, they actually have to have pleasurable and sexy things happening in order for desire to arise. And that is called responsive desire. The desire responds to something that precedes it. And what is that thing that, excuse me, what is that thing that desire is responding to? It's responding to stimulation. So when I talk about stimulation, there are different types of stimulation. And so I'm going to list a couple of them. Here's one that's really important for women: emotional stimulation. So it's asking the questions, do I feel cared for? Do I feel heard and seen for who I am, whether I'm sad or happy or wherever I am? Am I being valued? Do I feel safe to open myself up with this person that I'm with? Is it safe to be risky with my partner and really show myself vulnerably? There's also intellectual stimulation. So this is talking about something that's pushing your boundaries, that's thought-provoking. There's energetic stimulation, which is the presence that our partner has for us. Do they feel present with us? Are they there with us? Do I feel wanted by my partner? Are we connected, especially after a fight? Like, is there an energetic connection, or do we still feel distant and away from each other? There's also play. So are we having fun? Is there lightness and laughter? Now, it doesn't always have to be that there has to be play and lightness in order to be aroused for sex, but it's a big element in general for women's arousal. There's, of course, physical stimulation: touching, kissing, petting, close contact, holding hands. There's kinky/taboo stimulation. So this is role play, dominant, submissive kind of dynamic. There's control or sensation play, using ropes, floggers, being spanked or tickled, or doing something edgy, doing something that is not considered polite, or doing, getting outside of your comfort zone. And that kind of stimulation is very important for some women. There's also sensual stimulation. So being stimulated by the senses, be it fresh air or flowers or perfume, candles. There's visual stimulation. So being in a beautiful setting, or a setting that works for you, that doesn't distract you. Auditory, stimulation. There's nature. So for some women, being in nature, that they can feel that deep connection to nature, and that can feel like very arousing and nourishing. Sensation of water, silky sheets, beautiful lingerie. There's a whole range of sensual stimulation that turns women on. There's also spiritual stimulation, so feeling deeply connected to a source or being larger than you are. There's also spaciousness in your life, so having the capacity, both emotional and psychological capacity, to share yourself with your partner, or feeling really spread too thin and not able to do that, not able to have that capacity. And the last one is, and this one is very hard to describe in a few words, but I'm going to try, and I'm also going to address it a little bit later in the Q&A, is polarity. So what I mean by polarity is the feeling of oppositeness with your partner. So this can happen in a heterosexual relationship as well as a homosexual same-sex relationship. And that is having one partner carry and embody the masculine energy and the other person embodying the feminine energy, thus creating the polarity, the differentness of two people. And that creates magnetism. So opposites attract, opposites magnetize to each other. And again, this is very true in same-sex relationships, where usually one partner will carry the masculine pole, and one partner will carry the feminine pole, regardless of the actual gender of the person. And so that polarity creates that arousal, that stimulation, that attraction. And a colleague, Jaya, who's a sexologist in Los Angeles, she has a wonderful system to help you identify your erotic blueprint, which is basically what works for you in terms of stimulation and what creates arousal for you. And so desire is responsive to stimulation. And that happens because stimulation manifests as arousal. So really, when we think about it, women's sexual desire is highly dependent on our level of arousal. The more we can feel aroused, the more actually our desire arises. So I'll talk more about this connection, but first I want to define what is arousal. So arousal is a physiological and psychological state of being awoken, mentally, physically, in our senses. So it's really that feeling of being turned on. And that arousal doesn't have to be sexual. It's connected to our nervous system, and so we can get aroused when we're triggered by some kind of danger, and we can go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. But that same system also gets aroused sexually. So the nervous system does the same thing when we get aroused sexually. And what happens is that our consciousness, our attention gets more alert and sharp, and where we get better at information processing. All of that gets heightened in arousal. And what happens on the physical level is that the body actually gets activated. And in sex, it signals readiness for sex. So first, there's usually a quickening of the heartbeat. Maybe your palms might get a little sweaty. You might start getting a little warm. And then eventually, for men, their cock will get hard. And for women, there's an engorgement of sexual tissues, such as nipples, vulva, clitoris, vaginal walls, and you get to have vaginal lubrication as well. There's also relaxation of the muscles around all these areas, including hips, pelvis, and even lips and the mouth. As arousal happens, that prepares us for opening up for oral sex. And this arousal precedes desire for women. And it's going to be helpful now for the rest of the talk to switch to some charts. So it's going to be helpful to look at this visually and see side by side male and female arousal curves and how this looks in sex. So I do want to say that these are generalizations, and we have to generalize to some level to show a trend. And there are outliers or cases where this is different for different people. And I will talk about some of those cases as well. But do remember that a lot of this is generalization for the sake of showing the trend and what is happening at a larger level. So I'm going to switch to showing you some graphs. And give me 1 second. Okay. So right now I'm showing a chart, and I want to start by talking about men's sexual arousal. So this is a generalization, and it comes from a lot of studies. So men's sexual arousal is quite linear in the sense that I described before. So they have a thought of something sexy, and their arousal starts to go up, and it builds, and there's a point where it becomes a lot, to a lot of sensation, and then it drops down. And as you're looking at this graph, you want to see, I want to point to arousal is on the vertical axis, and then time is in the horizontal one. So according to a lot of studies, the average foreplay for sex is 15 minutes, and the average penetration is about 5 minutes. So this graph roughly depicts that. And so in this male arousal graph, you're looking at the sharp rise of this anticipation of sex and orgasm as the arousal rises. There's intense sensation in the peak, and then there's quick release. And for a lot of men, there's also a lot of pressure to maintain this, because there's a lot of pressure to stay hard. And when there's a lot of sensation, which is also, which pressure contributes to, then there's a lot of, this rise is very quick. There's a lot of sensation, and that has to be released. So this actually gets perpetuated very much in our media, where we look at how sex is portrayed in the movies, and it's very fast forwarded. We also, if we look at porn, foreplay happens over 1.5 minutes, and then penetration happens usually much longer, but this whole thing is shortened and reinforced in our culture. Now, women's curve is very different. So I'm going to progress to the next slide and show you women's curve of arousal. So first of all, it's a curve. It's an undulating curve that's non-linear, that goes up and down. And even though it progresses upward throughout, it has peaks and valleys and plateaus, and it's unpredictable. So there are deep dips pretty high up in the arousal, which really make no sense if we just think about it this way. And notice too that this curve is much longer. So an average time for arousal for pleasurable penetration for women is 30 to 45 minutes. And I'll talk more about what I mean by pleasurable penetration in a few moments. For now, I want to cover a little bit of what happens in this graph at different times. So I'm going to switch back to stop sharing the slide and come back on camera. So there are a couple of things that happens here. So as the arousal rises, there is the obvious thing that happens is that there's an increase in pleasure. Why that also happens is that there is a reduction in pain. The pain threshold goes up. So what that means is that as engorgement happens in all these different areas, from the nipples to the mouth, to the vulva, to the vaginal canal, so everything becomes supple and soft, and it stretches, and there's pleasure to be had from there. So I want to point a couple of things. So the tissues become more supple and more pliable, and they stretch, and they're able to accommodate a man's penis or a toy without tears. So that's a benefit of arousal. What else happens is that the insides also get engorged. And the cervix tilts upward to accommodate, as that engorgement happens, to accommodate for the penis once inside. And so that prevents the kind of pain that many women experience, which is what I experienced as well, is when the penis bumps up against the cervix, which can create excruciating pain. So during arousal, the cervix tilts, making room for the partner, and then also for deeper penetration and thrusting. And that happens eventually. That happens as you rise up the arousal curve, and usually not before 30 minutes or so into arousal. What else happens is nipples also become erect and more open to touch. So this explains why a lot of women will say, we don't like to be touched early on in foreplay. And that's because the body is just not ready. There's not enough arousal, and it doesn't feel good. The same thing happens a lot with genitals. So genital touch early in that chart doesn't feel good for most women because those parts are not yet aroused and the pain threshold is still very low. So if you think about it, if you catch a woman off guard, she's doing work and you pinch her nipples, and that's going to hurt. Now, if you are with a highly aroused woman in the middle of a sexual act, holding her nipples, pinching, pulling will actually feel very pleasurable for many women. And that's because, again, the pain threshold is much higher during arousal, and that happens much higher in the process. Now, I also want to point to the curve again, and actually I'm going to share that as well again so that you can see. So there are these points, these troughs, and I'm just going to zoom in this little, the beginning of the chart. There are these troughs that show up. So the arousal starts and then it drops and then it goes up again and then it drops again. And so I have these little asterisks there in those troughs. And what I want to talk about that is because we have one story of arousal, which is the masculine linear arousal. When a woman's arousal drops, which is totally normal, it's cyclical. Our bodies are cyclical, just like our periods are cyclical, just like other things in nature are cyclical, such as tides and seasons. This happens naturally to our bodies. But what happens, because we have this one narrative of what desire and arousal looks like, women start questioning themselves in that spot. So they start thinking, what's wrong with me? Why am I all of a sudden going down and don't feel anything? Why is my body not getting turned on? Am I broken? Am I not attracted to him? Is something wrong here? And so they start getting into their heads in shame, guilt, and whatever other kind of self-flagellation that can happen when you start asking yourself these questions. And that, of course, interrupts your arousal. So the more you're in your head and not allowing yourself to go on these waves, the more you get disconnected from the moment, from your partner, and from the arousal. And something similar happens to the men, because the men will feel, or your partner will feel, that you're also disconnecting, that there's a contraction that happens when we're fearfully asking these questions, what's wrong with me? They'll start thinking, what just happened? Did I do something wrong? How can I make her come back again? So that's a natural impulse for most men, is if she's dropping, to bring her back up, and maybe he needs to go faster. And that, again, breaks the connection and the arousal, because it's not actually going with what is, but trying to take the woman out of her process. And that usually doesn't feel good for women at all. If we're going down to try to rev us back up, that's kind of like trying to reverse a wave, try doing that, because there's so much momentum and power going with that. If you want to stop and reverse the wave, the way it's going that way, that's going to be really hard. And so for most women, this moment feels really bad in their bodies, like they're being kind of forced to go the way that their body is not going. And now I want to turn to the next slide and talk about specifically this area. So right now it's labeled diminishing returns. So if penetration sex, as well as for some women oral sex, happens in this area, and this is not some objective area, this is more of looking at this as your optimal or your basic arousal. So it doesn't mean that I'm talking specifically about necessarily the first 15 minutes or 20 minutes, but when the arousal is relatively low, and if you're going by the speed of your partner's arousal, having penetration sex, and like I mentioned, for a lot of women, oral sex in this place will create diminishing returns in your sex life. And let me break that down of why that happens. So the body is not yet aroused, and there is maybe some touch that kind of feels okay, but not really highly pleasurable. Maybe some of it is annoying, like getting your nipples touched and pinched when you're not really fully aroused. Or penetration where it feels kind of tight. Maybe there's not that much lubrication. Maybe there's a little bit of pain, or maybe it's just neutral. Like it's not painful, but it's neutral. Your body is not having the best possible experience, and it's going to know that. It's going to know that, and it's going to, because we are driven by pain or pleasure. So if your body is not having a pleasurable experience, it's at best going to be neutral about the next time you want to have sex. So if your arousal is very low and the experience not so great, the desire that comes out of that is going to be kind of neutral. Now, if this is a painful experience and it doesn't feel good and there's some annoyance, your body's not going to want more sex. So the desire is actually going to diminish. And if you continue having sex the same way, now with a little bit less desire, the body is actually going to be turned on slightly less, because the body knows and remembers previous experiences. We're wired so intelligently, and the body knows what's happening, and the body knows what's right for us and what's not. So if we continue having sex and it's kind of not comfortable, or it's at best neutral, next time the desire is going to be less. And then the body is going to be less excited, so less aroused, maybe a little bit more contracted, less of a good experience, less desire, and that becomes a diminishing return scenario or a vicious cycle. And this is a moment where some women will decide, because that's all that they have experienced, is I don't like sex. I'm probably one of those women who just doesn't like sex. I don't enjoy it. And they'll make that conclusion. And then there's some women who will want to just get it over with, because again, it's neutral at best. It's maybe a little uncomfortable or slightly pleasurable, but it's not something to be raving about. And so they're just going to want to get it over with. And that, of course, diminishes desire. I also want to debunk a myth here. So you hear a lot in magazines and even from doctors, gynecologists, of just start sex and you'll get turned on and that's fine. Well, the problem is that if you just start sex and you normally fall into this pattern, into this part of the graph, it's going to have diminishing returns. So this advice hardly works for anyone because that arousal, if there is no change in how you do sex and no change in this pattern, if your arousal is still kind of low, your body's not going to want more sex. Now, I want to also differentiate here a difference between arousal and orgasm. So they are sometimes the same, sometimes not. So many women can orgasm without any arousal. And they can actually induce their orgasm without the rest of the body being at all aroused. That can happen through physical stimulation with a vibrator, and it can happen, again, without any arousal. And many women will report that they'll feel a release from it, but they won't feel actually nourished or energized by it. And that is because that arousal is not there. So there is a release. So it may feel like you've released something, some pressure. It could be, a tension that you're holding or horniness, but it won't be nourishing because there's no actual arousal. And it is the arousal that actually enlivens us and feeds us and nourishes us. Now, there are also women that need high levels of arousal to be able to orgasm. And because that kind of orgasm is created from being so full and so turned on that the body actually needs to, the cup gets spilled over. And for a lot of women, that kind of orgasm happens much higher in this curve that you're looking at. Now, I want to switch to the upper right-hand quadrant of this graph, which is what's possible in this area where there's high arousal. And again, there's no objective level of high arousal. This means what I'm talking about here is high arousal for you. So it not necessarily at a specific time or a specific measurement of arousal, but learning, experimenting and learning and finding out what is that optimal high arousal for you. And so when we look at that upper right-hand quadrant, what's possible here is, aside from the engorgement in the body, so softening of the tissues, the suppleness, the ability to stretch, there's also a softening of the body. There is a heightened sensitivity to everything. So to touch, your fingers might feel so sensitive that you might feel everything on your partner's skin. There's a sense of excitement and kind of openness, of passion that's there. There's a loss of inhibitions and a sense of confidence, of freedom and opening. In this place, the body leads because the mind quiets down. So the mind stops chattering and figuring things out and criticizing, and the body just does what it wants. It moves in the ways that feel really pleasurable and intuitively does so. You start breathing differently, and you start shifting into positions that feel really good for you. There is a relaxation and surrender that happens at the same time as there is an excitement and a drive to continue and to move forward. So it's a kind of a very paradoxical place. And for women, it's a state of deep openness, opening our bodies, opening our hearts, and allowing our partners to really penetrate us in not just when I'm talking about genitals, but penetrating our hearts and connecting in this kind of, it's almost like an alternate state of consciousness where, again, the inhibitions are gone, there's a softening, and there's a connection that happens. And so what happens for couples in this place is that there is a sense of space, a loss of sense of space and time, and that you kind of start feeling like you're in a bubble with each other. You lose track of whose arms and hands are whose. You start to merge together and start to feel this sense of ecstasy. Again, it's not necessarily orgasm as in you're having an orgasm, but the whole state of being shifts to this kind of ecstatic, fluid, freeing space that has no boundaries. There's an ability to read each other's bodies and know what your partner is feeling. So a synchronicity that happens here. And what happens also in this place is that you start fucking heart to heart rather than just genitals, because you are, if your partner is able to meet you in that place in the upper right-hand quadrant, you're in such a deep state of openness that it becomes more than genitals. It becomes more than just two bodies creating friction, but it becomes a more of a spiritual and heartfelt experience. And so this spot is generative. And so what I mean by that is when a woman can remove her own impediments to this kind of deep arousal, so she can remove the shame and the guilt and really surrender and allow her body to get so aroused, and the man her partner can hold her there, meaning he can be there with her fully and not abandon her and not judge her, criticize her, but when he can really hold her in that place, that stage generates desire, because there's so much that's happening and it's so beautiful and open and connecting that actually leads to more and more desire. So when I say that the space is generative, it starts to create desire, and then the body starts asking for more. It starts asking for more connection, for more sex, for more touch. And in that place, your body is actually asking, begging for penetration. And I'm not exaggerating when I say when a woman's pussy will literally reach out and try to suck her partner's cock or a toy in. Like, that's the kind of arousal. This is the kind of readiness for sex that's available for women. That's so freeing and opening. And the more a woman can experience sex in this part, the more she feels fed and nourished, like this deep place in her gets touched and fed, a place of freedom and letting go and surrender that she cannot usually access in other ways. So when that place gets fed and nourished, she wants more of it. It's natural. We want more of it. We want to access that place. And, there's so many studies and so many articles saying how a woman, after sex, a woman will have a glow. And that's because that glow comes from this kind of nourishment and connection, and that it feeds the body, it feeds the woman emotionally, it feeds her soul, it feeds so many different aspects. And from that place, desire becomes generative. Her cup gets full, and then she wants to spill it over in terms of orgasm, or share it more with her partner, which means more sex. And what kind of orgasm is available here is so much more than just clitoral. So we're talking about cervical orgasm, vaginal orgasm, nipple orgasms, full body orgasm, even sometimes without touch or without penetration or without stimulation of the clitoris. But the body just feeling so aroused and turned on that it goes into this involuntary state. And also anal. So the arousal that I'm describing doesn't happen specifically around anal tissues. Those are not stretchable, which is why you really require lube to have anal play or anal intercourse. However, all of this is related, and the clitoris actually is so much bigger when you look at the whole structure on the inside. So we only see the tip that we know as the clitoris, but actually the whole structure is much bigger. And so when that arousal happens and all of this tissue gets aroused, it also affects other areas of our genitals, and it also impacts the kind of anal play you have and can lead to more anal orgasms. I'm going to take a sip of water. So I want to come back again to this topic of stimulation and arousal. So I want to emphasize this point. This is stimulation and the right kind of arousal for your body. And there is such a thing as overstimulation. So it can happen in a couple of ways, and here are two main ways. So one is overstimulation can happen for someone who is highly sensitive, and the foreplay, the touch can happen so quickly that actually her arousal curve will look very much like his on this graph, where it's a sharp ascent and then a descent. And even though she is wired and she would prefer a much slower peak and valley approach, because her body is so sensitive, the stimulation will be too much. She will get aroused very quickly and possibly climax, or just possibly like have that drop in sensation, and will not want any more touch, or this will also fall into this diminishing return spiral, and she will want less and less sex because it was just so fast and overwhelming, and it was too much. There was an overload. And so that kind of overstimulation, like I said, can contribute to the diminishing returns pattern. There's also overstimulation at the upper end. And it can be that you're going too fast, or you're going so high and really not pacing yourself. So it's going, the ups and downs are going, but they're squeezed in together very quickly. And so that overstimulation can happen at the top as well. And again, it won't feel very good, even though you're at the top level of arousal, but it can feel overwhelming and too much. Now, what can also happen is that when a woman really lets herself go in that top upper quadrant, and her partner is not there for her, she may get scared. She may get scared of her own arousal, whether or not the partner is there, or she may get scared of her own arousal, seeing that the partner is kind of withdrawing or somehow is dropping her. And that too can be very scary, and that can actually turn a woman off of the sexual experiences because it was too much and it didn't feel good at the end. And so the point of this is that it's very important to find your own pace, find your own curve, and find what works for you. And so these curves can look very differently. The arousal for some women could be much higher in the beginning, and then it drops, and then it plateaus, and then it goes up. Or it can look like this, where it's really like, it starts actually not from point zero, but kind of starts a little high, but then it just like sits flat for a while. And then it shoots up, and then it's kind of a little up, and then so the point is that there's no one way that this can look for women. There's no one curve for women. There's no even one curve for a single woman. This curve can look very different. If you're engaging in sexual activity in the morning versus the evening, if you're engaging it at 3 p.m. and at 4 p.m., the curves will look completely different, because the nature of the curve is that it's unpredictable and it happens completely naturally wherever the woman is at that moment. So it definitely complicates things, but it also creates an adventure. You get to go on this ride, and you get to experience it, and you get to explore what your body does. And this is where this also applies to men. So there's a lot of men who also follow this kind of curve rather than that linear pattern that I showed that's kind of generalizing men's arousal. And the men who follow the curve are also more responsive to different kind of stimulation. And a lot of the time, it's also that negative stimulation. So if there's an absence of the kind of stimulation they need, or there's a pressure to go faster, or there is a lot of shame for not looking like that regular male arousal curve, and which is a sign of manhood, that these men will feel a lot of shame about experiencing sex this way, and this can cause a lot of erectile dysfunction problems, because there's a pressure for them to get hard very quickly, and to for it to look a certain way, to get aroused if they think of a sexy thought, and they function more on this the female arousal curve. And so none of this is prescriptive. None of this applies completely to everyone, and there are, like I mentioned just now, times when this applies to actually men. And now I want to talk to a couple of, I'm going to turn this off so that I can get back on screen. 1 second. Okay. So I want to mention a couple of impediments to women's arousal. And if you've read any of my articles recently, I've talked a lot about these, like some of the libido killers for women. And the first one is this phrase, can we have sex tonight? Or just that question like, hey, honey, can we have sex? Now, this phrase is guaranteed to kill women's libido on the spot. And that is because, as I showed you, the arousal path is nonlinear. It is not consistent time to time. And part of the fun, part of the experience for a woman is to just follow that path, follow those cycles, and allow them to happen. And so when a woman's partner asks her, can we have sex tonight? In a way, it dismisses her process of getting aroused, because women cannot just get aroused like turning a switch on. It's a process, and it requires different kinds of stimulation, the kind of stimulation I mentioned up in the beginning, and usually a lot of it. And it often feels kind of like really like feeling not understood. It's in a way of like, if someone in a wheelchair is sitting next to you and kind of without thinking, asking them, hey, could you grab me a soda? Knowing that that person cannot get out of the wheelchair and go get you soda. And that often feels like this for women, that it's like, she cannot explain what's happening for her, but she knows that she cannot do this. She cannot just spontaneously get turned on. Now, there's a caveat. So like I mentioned, in that upper right-hand quadrant where the arousal is generative, the more a woman can hang out in that space each time she has sex, her desire actually becomes more spontaneous. So she becomes more in a way like the classic man, where she sees her partner naked and she wants to have sex, or she has a thought of, yeah, we made love last night like this, I want more of it. And she can actually get turned on. But that happens after you have reached that place, because you're building off of momentum. So that phrase, back to the phrase of, hey, honey, can we have sex tonight, is a big libido killer. And I'm going to share screen again. And also mention that there's this 0.0 on the graphs. And this is what we think of as that moment where a partner asks, hey, can we have sex tonight? And that's when sex starts. But that's not how women's arousal and our bodies work. Sex doesn't start at that moment. Sex happens much earlier. It happens way before. So if I would extend this line way to the left, because our arousal happens way before that moment when we get in the bedroom and we curl up next to each other and the partner asks, can we have sex? And this is also why this standard advice that we hear from actually a lot of also sex coaches is have date nights and plan a nice date night and have a sex night. And the problem with that is, again, well, if we think about women's lives, we are so busy. We're taking care of homes, work, children. We have so much going on in our heads that's distracting us, that even if we're planning a sex night, there's so much leading up to it that's actually disturbing our arousal, that's taking away from it, that when we get to sex night, we actually have finally a chance to just sit down and breathe and relax. And it's not time for arousal, it's actually time for rest. And we need to think of arousal as happening way before that 0.0, that classic time when we're getting together to have sex. Related to all of this that I mentioned about kind of respecting the process is, this happens actually for both men and women. So most women will feel a lot of guilt and shame about this process, about this undulating process. They'll feel like they're taking too much time, the partner maybe is getting bored, that they're too much, that their bodies are just not responsive fast enough. And in going in our heads, like I mentioned early on, kills our own arousal. It interrupts that normal flow and kills it. So if you think of these ups and downs as waves, it is natural for a wave to go up, crest, fall, and then roll back into the ocean. And we never think of that cresting and falling as a bad thing. It's just a natural part of the wave. And then when we think of that water rushing, going back into the ocean, it's actually such a good thing because it's feeding back into the cycle and actually helping build up the next wave coming in. So the same thing in our peaks and then troughs. Those troughs are there to get some rest, to reconnect to what is happening, to mediate the arousal so it's not too fast, so it's right for our bodies. And our bodies will know what that rate is, what that speed is, if we really listen to them. It's a moment to reconnect to our partners and maybe ask them for what else we need or what we want, or just tell them we love them or whatever it is. But those troughs are not bad. They're actually really positive and they're really needed in order for us to sustain that long journey. So if you were hiking, it's about slowing down and just resting a little bit and building up more strength to go on. And a big turn off to arousal is also when men are trying to change that, when they're like, okay, well, I don't want her to go down, so I'm gonna touch her faster or stroke her or do something to fix the situation, and that kills our arousal. Another big arousal impediment is going for the goal. So that can look like going for the orgasm, which then makes everything that you do kind of like just a stepping stone to orgasm. And if you think of the baseball analogy, it's like first base, second base, third base in order to hit the home run. So what happens is that oftentimes we start rushing through the kissing, the touching, the maybe pausing and eye gazing and looking at each other or other things in order to get to the goal. And that usually feels terrible for women. It feels terrible it often feels like we're being used in order, like our arousal is a requirement for sex. So let's get through arousal very quickly in order to get to sex, to that home base. And it often feels like we're being done to rather than we are being with from our partners. And that again feels awful and terrible and will kill arousal for women and breed a lot of resentment as well. And so the antidote to that is thinking of all of these bases as goalless. Like if you want to kiss and pet and then kiss again for like 45 minutes and then go back to petting and touching and stroking genitals and go back to kissing and just enjoying it for its own sake. Just like if you were enjoying an ice cream cone and like devouring because it tastes so good, enjoying it for that rather than enjoying it for some kind of goal that you want to get to eventually. And that's really important, this kind of goalless exploration and going with a journey wherever it takes you, whether it's orgasm or not. But trusting that it's going to take you to a really powerful place is really important. And then lastly is the big impediment is our own inner talk that happens inside. So this is fear of losing control. Fear of opening up so much and showing so much of ourselves to our partners. And that feels very scary for most people. There's fear of being hurt, obviously, when you're opened up so much. There is fear of being dropped by your partner. So having your partner withdraw when you're most naked and vulnerable, or be judgmental towards that state. There's, of course, shame and trauma that plays a part in this. So shame about how long you take, what you look like, what your flavor of arousal and orgasm is, what your body looks like. Trauma, it could be sexual trauma, but it doesn't have to be. It could be relational trauma. So judgment that was passed on to you in a past relationship, or someone dropped you before. and that creating irrational fear of, if this partner is very supportive, but you still have that reaction that I can't let myself go to that arousal because I fear being dropped. So all of these are really big impediments to being aroused. And so what that does is that it holds women in that diminishing returns area of sex. And all of these things that I mentioned, as well as, it's very normal for both men and women to start thinking that if a woman doesn't seem to like sex and she's not getting aroused, she doesn't want sex, it's not generating that desire, that it means that we have different libidos. And there's a lot that gets wrapped up in that. So a lot of conclusions that, oh, you just don't want to have sex, or you don't want to have sex with me. And it starts being this huge thing in the relationship that's so much more about libidos and desirability and attraction and love and so much more. But a lot of it, if you drop down, comes to differences in arousal, which can be aligned, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So of course you're wondering at this moment, what do we do? How do we align these? How do we get to that upper right-hand quadrant for both of us, so that the man can last and enjoy his journey there, and to join together? So I'm going to start with men. And what men can do here is to learn to be okay with these ups and downs and the unpredictability. And this is really hard for men. Their natural instinct is or anyone with a masculine orientation, to jump into problem solving and resolution. And the learning here is stretching your ability to be with ups and downs, with uncertainty, with a loss of control, because you don't know what's happening next and whether what you're doing is going to lead to anything. And learning to do that, to practice that kind of surrender. And instead, in that place, so instead of trying to do something to the woman, is actually pay very close and exquisite attention to what's happening. So think of a surfer analogy. You have to be very in tune with the waves. You have to be very surrendered. At the same time, you have to be in control. So that control comes from consciousness and awareness, rather than trying to control the environment. As a surfer, as a sailor, you cannot control the environment. The ocean is much stronger and bigger than you are. But the key is to start to pay close attention, to stay really conscious, and to learn how to ride the waves. And that's where you actually are able to be in control without grasping or holding for control. And in that place, you can actually be with your partner, not just do something to her, but actually be with her and support her as she rides these waves together with you. For her, it's the same new experience. It's not like she knows where she's going herself either. And so that creates that connection and partnership. There's also this piece of creating a safe space for her to go on her ride. So what I mean by saying safe space is by being in approval of wherever she goes, whatever that wave looks like, without judgment, without trying to get her to do something, but just being there and supporting her as she goes through that. And what happens for men when they do that is that they actually go on the ride too. They get to surf the waves, and they get to experience that range of sensations, and also that heightened sense of arousal and opening that the woman has experienced as well. And this also is about expanding what sex means. So not just thinking of sex as that 0.0 on the chart, but actually thinking of everything that you do as part of sex. So I hear this a lot, like if you want to have sex on Saturday, you start on Monday working up, and not in a way where you're like buttering up the woman to have sex with on Saturday, but that everything that you do in the process is about sexual connection and about arousal and about being together. So you can take that, what you can have at the actual time you're having sex, and transplanting it and making and adding that to the rest of your life. And the other huge thing is for men to learn how to be with their own sensations. So the arousal curve is so short, the rise to orgasm and the drop is so quick because the arousal goes up so quickly. There's so much sensation and then there's so much pressure to release it. That's accentuated by our focus on porn. It's also just a natural outcome of men's sexuality and boys masturbating a lot. So the more you masturbate, the more actually you speed up that process. And so the work here for men is to learn how to stay with the heightened sensation without expelling it through orgasm and delay ejaculation, so that your arousal curve looks more like the feminine curve and it can last much longer. And so you can meet each other in a much heightened, much more pleasurable state, connected state for both of you. Now, I want to talk about women, of what women can do to turn themselves on. So you remember that slide where I extended the line way left to the left of that 0. So this is where women can do so much to turn themselves on before sex and outside of sex. And it starts with nourishing yourself and living and leading a turned on life. So what do I mean by that? So all those ways that we get stimulated, so the touch, the spaciousness, of course, relaxation as an antidote to stress, a lot of the things that we need to do on our own. So there's basic stress reduction. So calming your mind, removing things out of your schedule that drain you, that take away from that space to actually experience this on your own and experience this with your partner. This is a lot of connecting to your sensuality. So spending time. So if you like baths, taking a bath and enjoying the water, enjoying the bubbles. If you love flowers and it feeds you visually and through smell, buying yourself a bouquet of flowers. It's about creating quiet time. So if you really nourished by quiet time, to spend, at least 15 minutes a day of just by yourself, especially if you have a really busy life with children and work and all sorts of things. It's about also movement. And I'm not talking about gym. I'm talking about free movement. So it could be going in nature and moving and walking around. It could be dancing in the kind of like free form kind of style dance where you get to move your body and get in touch with it and connect it. And of course, this is also self-pleasure. And I don't mean necessarily using a vibrator to orgasm, but I mean exploring yourself, touching your breasts, touching your genitals, touching your whole body, touching your face, and connecting to the pleasure of touch. All of these things. So when I work with women clients, we work on prioritizing all of these and actually so prioritizing one thing and then making it happen so that it's in your schedule. And in order to do that, we do a lot of removing guilt and shame about having those needs and giving yourself permission to do this for yourself. And not only because it builds your arousal, but because it's part of nourishing your holistic well-being that includes sexuality, because all of these things are connected in every way. And like I mentioned again, a big piece for women is being okay with the ups and downs and honoring your body, honoring that wave, honoring what happens, letting go of shame and guilt, and then allowing yourself to really relax and ride those waves. Just think of it, if you were trying to ride the wave in the ocean and you were stiff and scared and holding on, that's not going to be a pleasurable ride. It's going to be a hard one and a stressful one. So learning to be able to let go of shame and guilt and relax is a big piece. And to be able to say no to penetration that's too early. So a lot of women will have sex when they're just turned on enough. Just like, okay, he can get in, it feels okay, it feels slightly pleasurable, but that's just like that just enough place. And practicing saying no, practicing having the courage to say no to that place and to ask your partner what you need, what you want in order to get to the higher states of arousal where penetration, it can be deeper and more pleasurable and can take on a whole different meaning and state. And along this lines too is a piece about having sex for your own pleasure. So learning how to enjoy all of this for yourself, how to ask for what you want and be able to enjoy it and receive it and feel good about it. And this is a whole big part of the work that I do with women is, again, having them let go of shame and guilt around this, giving themselves permission to enjoy and receive what is happening. And then lastly, what can couples do around this is have more of the things that actually, if you think about, we have in the beginning of relationships. So in the beginning of a relationship, we really pay attention to each other. We're curious, we're open, we pay attention. And women will receive a lot of attention from men. Spontaneous texts, hey, I'm thinking about you, flowers, dinner, spontaneous touch, long makeouts, lots of closeness, holding hands. And a lot of that goes away when life gets real. And what's really important is to bring that back. And when I say bring that back, it's this explorative, goalless connection and attention and touch that we have in the beginning of the relationship. And that has to be deliberate. That has to be consciously planned and added. Not necessarily planned as in you have to plan what you're doing, but you have to make space for that. You have to make time for this kind of connection and attention, which creates that stimulation, which feeds all these different areas of a woman's arousal. So that arousal heightens, she enjoys sex, she wants more of it, it becomes more spontaneous. And so, when I work with couples, I teach them a lot of different practices to help them do that, to help them reconnect emotionally, to help them connect physically. There's a lot of practices that help them explore touch, and especially couples who've been disconnected for a long while. A lot of this is rediscovering themselves and rediscovering each other. And the last point I want to leave you with here is that this is about women's desire, and underneath that women's arousal is to be awakened and is to be fed and nourished rather than turned on. And that's something that both men and women have to realize in order to be able to get to those heightened levels, in order to be able to get to this kind of place of joyful, nourishing, connected, enlivening experience, sexual experience. So with that, I'm going to take a moment to let you know that I have a special offer for you. So I'm offering free 1-hour consultations to women and or couples who are interested in exploring this work. And I have 3 spaces for clients starting in December, and then also 3 spaces starting in January. So this is a limited time offer. And these consultations go really quickly. And if you'd like to get a consultation, I encourage you to email me at Irene@irenefehr.com as quickly as possible with just a few lines explaining your situation and what you're looking for. And we'll set up that consultation and hopefully get you a spot to help you realize what's possible for you as a woman, what's possible for you as a couple, what's possible for your sexuality, and at a deeper level, what's possible for your aliveness and your life in general. So with that, I'm going to take a sip of water and look at if there's any questions and if there's any live questions, and then also I'm going to answer some of the questions that I got ahead of time. So if you'd like to submit a question, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and submit. You can click anonymous to not have your name included. and I will answer your questions as they come. And while that's happening, I'm going to answer some questions that came ahead of time. So the first question I got was, so what advice or counsel do you have for a husband or wife whose spouse has no interest in intimacy and sex over the course of many months or even years? I'm fully committed to my marriage, but I never imagined that I said for better or worse, it meant this. So whoever wrote this, I really feel your pain. It's a really hard place to be in when there is such a discrepancy, when one partner wants that connection and intimacy and the other person is not available, not able, is not wanting to do that. And it sounds like this is an important thing for you. So I hear a lot of pain in that question. And it is a complicated question. So I want to kind of reflect back on the webinar and see if any of these scenarios resonate for you. If any of the things that I talked about in terms of diminishing returns, the area of arousal that leads to diminishing returns, if that sounds familiar to what maybe has been happening for you. So libido doesn't disappear out of nowhere, that there are things that lead up to it. It could be external things such as stress, such as work, such as hormonal issues, such as a whole slew illnesses, such a whole slew of things. But then there's also internal aspects as well. And women's libido is responsive to both positive stimulation and then also negative stimulation. It's two sides of the same coin. And so if there are things that were happening in your relationship in the past, such as disconnect, discord, withholds, like one partner not really able to share what's happening for them, that unresolved conflict is going to contribute to the woman's arousal. And this requires a lot of conversations, mediated by a third party, which is very helpful because this area is so sensitive and it's loaded with hurt, sadness, resentments, power struggles, all sorts of things. And it's important to have someone else mediate that conversation and share feedback and facilitate that reconnection. And of course, now that you watch this webinar, seeing also what kind of things can you do to awaken your partner's arousal. So different kinds of stimulation. It could be emotional stimulation, mental, physical, just generally being more close on a regular basis, way before that 0 point. Starting on a Monday if you want something to happen on Saturday. And seeing if that will shift things. But of course, that also has to be talked about, and finding out what's going on with your partner is the first step. Like what's going on emotionally, what are their desires, what maybe contributed to them withdrawing before. So the next question I have is, for a couple who has not had any intimacy for 6+ months, where the fire has literally gone out, what tools can we use to reignite initially? We do love each other, but after a period of non-activity, how do you get it back? Once the fire goes out, it is so much more difficult to get it going again. Absolutely. And the answer to this question is very similar to the one that I just answered, which is kind of understanding and connecting over what had you disconnect, really starting to identify not so much why we disconnected. You don't want to be asking why questions because you start going into analytics and figuring it out, but asking each other, like, what's going on for you? What are you feeling right now? What had you pull away? And make it a lot more open-ended. And then after that, or if you've already done that, is to start to reconnect with each other through a process of rediscovery. So if you haven't connected for 6+ more months, you're different people. You're different people even than you were before. You're different people than you were yesterday, much less 6 months ago. So a lot of this is reconnecting through touch. So starting to really start touching each other and exploring your bodies and what feels good. And then you also do that verbally. and asking, what do you want and what feels good to you? And there's also a different level of exploration too that's important, of asking, well, what's important to you about sex, or what has worked for you in the past? What do you want more of or less of? So that you learn from your past experiences and start to rediscover what's really important to you. Now, these questions are really important, but most people do not consciously ask them, and they really don't know what sex means to each other. They don't know why it's important. They don't know what's really happening. And so a lot of that is rediscovery or discovery of that aspect of your relationship. And doing all of it too without goal, like you're not trying to get to sex and therefore you're doing it, but actually approaching it with a lot of curiosity and openness, the way you would if you were starting to date with each other. Another question I have, and please send your Q&As if you'd like to to have your question answered right now. Please submit it during the Q&A function right in the bottom of your screen, and I'd love to get a live question. And excuse me, I just gonna close that for a second. So another question I have is, how would a woman with a feminine essence, who is a man who's very feminine, encourage her man to bring out more masculine energy in the bedroom and otherwise, without downright saying, be a man? How can she nudge, encourage, and enliven his masculine presence without saying anything directly? So first, I want to say that this question of sexual polarity is a huge topic, which I'm not going to be able to answer in any great detail. I mentioned it earlier on that this is part of the arousal, is being around someone with the opposite energy. It's kind of like yin and the yang, like complementing each other, but being opposites. So this is a huge topic, and I really can't cover it in depth, but I do want to say one thing. So for those people who don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about polarities, is that we're talking about sexual essences. So feminine essence is flowing, free, relaxed, mysterious, just like the graph, unpredictable. Sometimes wild and free, other times nurturing and soft and grounded. And we often think of that as being, that's the feminine. And people who embody that essence, if that's their core essence, then they will say that that's a woman with a feminine essence, or that's a man with a feminine essence. Now, the masculine essence is directed, unwavering in his presence and drive towards a goal, seeking often release or resolution, or what we think of as fixing it. And so again, there could be a woman who feels like her home is masculine, the masculine essence, and then there's men who feel like their home is masculine essence. And so per the question, the woman wants to evoke the woman whose essence is feminine wants to evoke more of the masculine in her man. And here's the thing, you cannot nudge anyone to be anything, especially nudge a man to be masculine. What you can do is to evoke the masculine in a man. And you do that by actually dropping deeper into your feminine. And one of those ways is releasing the thought of fixing him or having him a different way. So polarities work through opposites. So when you're more relaxed, when you are not grasping for control and trying to get your man to be something else, that's the moment where actually the man has more space and freedom and an invitation to step into his masculine. And that's when you fall into place in terms of your feminine essence, he will fall into place in his masculine. And vice versa. So when men want to evoke more of the feminine or arouse more of the feminine essence in the women, it's about them standing in their masculine polarity. And what that usually looks like is being more present and conscious and attentive, that unwavering, giving the woman unwavering presence and support so that she can relax and she can be more in her feminine. And that's all I'm going to say on the topic. It's a huge topic, and I highly encourage you check out the work of David Data on this topic, which is a very important one when it comes to sexual attraction and this topic in general. Another question I got is, how can I make sure I'm fully lubricated and not suffering vaginal dryness? So I answered this question a lot in many ways throughout the webinar. And so a lot of this has to do with stimulation, the right amount and the right kind for your body. Now, this cannot be predicted ahead of time. I cannot, by looking at you, say that this is the kind of arousal that would feel good to you. That has to be tested through different kinds of touch, different kind of arousal. Some women get turned on by kinky and taboo arousal, that kind of psychological play or sensational play. Other women get turned on by polarities. Other women get turned on by different kinds of touch, or all types get turned on by different kinds of touch. And so a lot of this, you need to research and find out what your body wants, what you want, and see and really experiment. Do this is the response. Do this over time, this is the response. Okay, try something else and do that once or do that over time and see how that affects you. So a lot of this has to do with experimentation and finding out and doing that on your own, and then doing it with your partner and asking for what you need in order to get fully aroused and get fully lubricated. Now, there's some nuances to that, such as menopause, but essentially the answer is the same. So when you're in menopause, your body changes, and women have to go through a process of relearning what works for them and starting to ask their partners for something different that was working for them when they were in their 30s or 40s, and understanding your body and finding those different things that work for you. All right, I'm going to answer one more question. And this question is, I got married 2 months ago, and me and my husband are of the same age, 39. We don't have any medical conditions for me. And for me, it was the first experience of having sex on our wedding night. We're having sex every day, long sessions, average 1 hour, penetrating, and I'm enjoying it with him, but I don't reach the level of getting really aroused. He's tried different positions and he can't understand why he can't make me orgasm. I'm a beginner. I don't know how to perform, and I can't find my pleasure points to guide him. I don't know what should please me. I believe I need time to get it. So I'm trying not to think much of it, but not to stress both of us, but I need to know how to work on myself. What do I do? So whoever submitted this question, I just really admire your willingness and courage to learn. You're a beginner, and in your relationship, you're like willing to discover that. And I really admire that. I'm really appreciating that about you and about the comment that you've submitted. So here, aside from everything else that I also mentioned, I want to say too is work on getting aroused before penetration. So way before, and it can be through erotic touch and massage. So this could be vaginal massage. This could be a practice of orgasmic meditation where there's a container, but there's no goal. You're not trying to get off. You're not trying to have orgasm, but you're just learning to enjoy and receive sensation. And what that does is that it actually rewires your body. For a lot of women who try to get to reach an orgasm, that creates a very dangerous vicious cycle, because that pressure gets their body all tightened, prevents arousal, and it gets that diminishing returns cycle going. You want to create a space where you're just playing with each other. He's playing with your clitoris. He's touching your labia. He's enjoying it. You're enjoying it. You're not trying to get to orgasm. And what happens to your body is that in that space, it relaxes, the nervous system relaxes, it stops trying, and it starts to just receive pleasure. And at some point, you will be able to build up that arousal that will lead to orgasm. There's a little bit of technique around that, but more than anything, it's about attunement, it's about removing the goal, and it's about trying and playing different things will feel good to you. And again, like I said, it's a lot of it stuff that precedes that point of sex. So getting into bed at that point 0. So sensual play, kinky play, it could be a variety of different things that you may not even think of. And with working with a coach, you can learn all the different things to look at and all the different ways to approach self-exploration that you may not think of. So I would definitely recommend either checking out working with me or someone like Jaya. She has this erotic blueprint, wonderful erotic blueprint system that helps you tune into what your arousal is, which I use with my clients a lot as well. And feeding on that, feeding off of that stimulation and getting that arousal way before you have sex. So for a lot of women, that arousal can't happen once they're actually having penetration. That has to be happening beforehand. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. We have several more questions here that were submitted ahead of time, and I'm going to answer those questions and post those answers on a webpage so you can access them. And I want to offer again the consultation offer. So I'm offering 1 hour free consultations for people, for women, for couples who are interested in doing this kind of work, exploring what this looks like for them, exploring what's possible, and creating a path forward. So if you'd like to claim one of those consultations, email me at irenefehr.com. And I hope that this was informative. I know this was a lot of information. If you have any questions, please email me as well. And please share this with other women, with other couples, with other men, with anyone who can benefit from understanding how we're different, but then also understanding how to feed ourselves in these differences in order to be able to get aroused and access this amazing, beautiful, nourishing, joyful place of sexual connection and pleasure that's possible. So thank you so much for attending. Bye.